Conversations with my mother.
Greetings, Empresses. Welcome once again to Conversations with My Mother. This is my mother, Dr. Betty Burston.
And this is my daughter, Dr. Shatria Collier.
So today, ladies, we are going to get into a very important topic. There's really a lot of research out there, and it's on effective communication with men. How to communicate effectively with men. And then you had a great title, Mommy. What was your title again?
Saying it gently.
Saying it gently.
Or communicating with men in order to get better results.
So let's talk about that. So you were saying, well, what are one of the things that you think leads to relationship failure?
The single most important thing that leads to relationship failure, whether it's in the suitor stage or whether it's in the marital stage, is communications. It's how we as women have come to communicate with men. And you notice I say have come to communicate with men because historically there were actually institutional sanctions against women communicating with men in a certain way. But those no longer exist, so it's up to us as women to be able to communicate with men in such a way that it leads to relationship growth, stability growth, and the wonderful romance that we all desire.
What do you think before, we have a great list of just some historical research that has been done about effective communication, so I'm going to draw from that in a moment. But what do you think is one of the major issues with women in communication currently?
I've noticed that with women in your generation particularly, and younger women, when I was growing up, and when women my age, and as I've mentioned to all of you before, I'll be 65 in August. So when our generation was growing up, it was a part of the norms and the folkways that you communicate with your family, whether it's your husband and your children, in a certain way, that you are supposed to show the greatest levels of love, respect, courtesy, and all of that to your family, to your husband, and to your children. I have noticed that with women in your generation and younger, that it seems to have inverted itself, that there are ways that women will talk to their husbands, their mate, and their children that they wouldn't talk to their best friend in that way. They wouldn't yell at their best friend. They wouldn't speak harshly to their best friend. They wouldn't call their best friend bad names. I have noticed that some women in this generation will do that in the family. They will do it with their husbands and their mates, and they will do it with their children. And so today we want to focus on the communications with the mate.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to be pulling from Hunt and Reitman. It's a classic study, and what they do is they just talk about positive and negative responses in communication. So I'm going to go down the list. On the first side are negative ways that we can communicate, and then they give you an alternate way of communicating. So number one, they say that women or people often order, direct, and command. So for example, one might say, stop ordering me around. You can't buy that. Don't talk to me like that. Instead, they should say, well, before I go into the instead, what are your thoughts?
Well, let's look at this whole issue of, oftentimes now, our husbands will make imperative statements. And in a sense, as the head of our household, ultimately all the responsibility falls upon him. But he shouldn't do it to us in a rude way. But we as women should never do that. Do not try to tell men what to do. If a man is driving off a cliff, just take your parachute and open it. But do not say, hey, you're driving off the cliff. Don't even say, honey, you're driving off the cliff. Just let him drive off the cliff and hope that he survives.
And they say a positive way of saying it is that you appear very disappointed, or let's discuss whether that would be a good purchase, or when you talk like that, I feel frightened. So how do you think about the way that they say it, the positive way they say it?
Well, I agree to some degree, but I also think a lot of the things we shouldn't say anything about it. You know, See, we as women, we have to choose our battles carefully. And I mentioned before that in a sense, the energy of a household, whether it's positive or negative, flows through the woman. Because we as women have the power to calm tensions in the household when we see them developing and building up instead of adding to those tensions. Sometimes, instead of doing what he says do, where we surface it, I like to use what happens in nature. If we get a pimple and we don't touch that pimple, the pimple is going to heal itself. But if we begin touching it and rubbing it, the friction itself causes that pimple to grow and to leave a scar. And I think the same thing is true in human communications, is that so many things don't need to be discussed. We let them, allow them to dissipate of their own accord so that we can choose our battles carefully.
But I don't know. I have to disagree with that, because I feel that, that means that some women are just going to become so, not women, people, when they stifle their communication, they become repressed.
Well,
Where they're like, I'm going to just sit back. Oh, strike one, strike two, strike three. And then they just go crazy.
No, I agree when it's like that.
Yeah.
But see, it's our attitude toward things that determines whether it bothers us. If it bothers you, you talk about it. But I'm talking about a level of communication. If you actually have trust that in the long run, your husband is going to make decisions that are good, and that if he makes a bad decision or he does something he should not do, he's going to self-correct. And see, self-correction is very important.
Yes.
Then it means that it's not going to be inside of you fuming and growing. Because see, if it's there, you need to say something. What I'm talking about is a whole different level where in your head, when you look at it, you're not passing these judgments. Well, he did it this way. He should have done it this way. I don't know why he hasn't paid the phone bill late. He forgot to pay it and they turned it off. So what? When they turn it off, he's going to know he forgot to pay it. And he's going to get it turned back on.
Okay.
Do you see?
Okay, let's go to, I'm not going to go down this whole list. I'm just going to pick out a few that I find interesting. So another thing they say is when we advise, give, or solutions or suggestions. So a negative way is, why don't you try, or you ought to stay home more. What do you think about this whole idea of women advising? Because I feel like a lot of women I know advise their men, and I feel that that eventually makes us fall into the mother role and not the queen empress role.
Exactly. And we all of us as women, we're so full of, because it comes out of our nurturing, we are full of advice. And we can advise our friends and advise our children if they ask, our friends if they ask us. We advise too much, period, by offering too much unsolicited advice. But again, when you begin to advise your man, your husband or your suitor, it shows an absence of confidence in him. And he resents that. So you can't advise him.
Yes.
You can offer, the only time when you offer advice is if you see something is critical to both of your lives and it's very important to him. And then you may say, hey honey, you may want to consider getting a haircut before you go on that audition. Do you see? But we have to be very gentle. He doesn't want us to be their mothers.
Exactly.
Do you see? So it's very important.
So they say, instead of what I've said previously, they said it might be better to say, what could you try? Or would it help you if
you do that, but he can see through that. So that's why a lot of the do's I disagree with. The don'ts, I agree with all of the don'ts in the article, because he knows that's thinly veiled advice still. So we have to be very, very careful. And I'm not saying never offer advice, but we have to be very careful how we do it and when we do it.
Okay. Another one here is judging, criticizing, and blaming. So if you say, you were wrong, it's all your fault, what a stupid idea.
And we do that as women. We judge, we criticize, if we took the time that we spend being critical of our mates, if we took the same time and we inverted it and we looked at our own imperfections, we would be so much stronger. And the other thing that becomes is a shield. By focusing on his imperfections, it forces, it allows us to let our imperfections go unaddressed. So if we turn that inward, then every time we began wanting to criticize him, turn it inward and say, oh, what can I do to, did I read as much today as ought? Did I educate myself today? Did I do my exercise, which I don't do? But, you know, turn it inward to say, how can we be better?
Yeah. I think that's a great one. And he said a positive way would be to say, those two statements seem to conflict, or let's do what we can to solve it, or let's see if that idea will work.
He's a male telling you. I disagree with that. So.
Okay. What about praising, agreeing, and evaluating? He said a negative way is, I think you are absolutely correct, or you do so many good things.
But see, sometimes we try to flatter men. See, it has to be sincere, whatever we say. And sometimes women use that as a tool, a flattery as a tool, but they can see through that unless it's very sincere. Do you see? So that's why that becomes. And then some of the other things we talked about last week was, where were you? That questioning, putting them on. You know, you're the judge and the jury, and they are the defendant sitting there. Those are terrible ways of communicating.
Okay, and here's our last one that I'll go into, ladies, and this is, he says in terms of interpreting, analyzing, and diagnosing, he says the negative thing to say is, if you weren't so tired, you could see my point, or you don't care what I think.
All of those are very negative ways. If we, as women, wake up in the morning, and we reach over and you and your mate kiss each other, okay? As you're going through the day, as you pass by each other, you kiss and you touch. Those are the positive ways of communicating. There's a whole, and we'll talk about that next time. So.
Okay, so he says that he said we need to increase sensitivity. He said it's better to say, if you prefer, we can discuss this another time, or right now I'm feeling so alone and left out. I don't know about that.
Well, as I said, most of what he says we ought to do, he's looking at it from a male's perspective, how one male, because there's human communications, and how one male, say, would communicate with another. As I said, I think with us, we want to be the sunshine in our families' lives.
Yes. And I think that's important. And if you want to look more, also Dr. John Gray does some great work on communication between males and females. Deborah Tannen also does some great work. And also, ladies, I want you to look at yourself this week and the way you communicate, not just with your king, but with people at work and people around you. And because that's something I've been looking at and thinking, man, how can I soften the way that I communicate with everybody? Okay, Empress, is anything else you want to leave?
No,
Okay, have a wonderful week and we love you. Mwah.